And welcome, everybody, to the PCS Like a Pro show. Glad you're joining us today. I am Megan Harless, your host, like always, and we've got a great show for you today, talking about an aspect of military life that we don't usually hear a lot about. Before we get to that, I just want to kind of provide a sort of answer to a question we've seen a lot in our PCS groups, asking about the mileage rates and the cost of fuel going up, and will anything be done to kind of help that piece out a little bit. So I want to let you know we have reached out to Transcommon Services. We have asked about that mileage rate. It's currently 18 cents per mile that you can be reimbursed for up to 2 POVs that you have when you move. And we've asked about that. Currently, there is no change for that mileage rate to increase. That mileage rate is set by the IRS, and apparently they are not looking at increasing it right now. I believe the services are looking at other avenues to try to help the cost of fuel. But just keep in mind, you do have your dislocation allowance, your DLA, that you can use to help offset that cost of fuel. And any expenses that are not reimbursed on your move, like the cost of fuel, because you'll be over that POV mileage reimbursement rate, you can use on your taxes next year when you go to file them. So keep your receipts for that, keep a tracker of what your expenses are that aren't reimbursed, and you can definitely use that next year on your taxes. But just want to let you know, we all have asked, and there is no definitive answer on anything yet. But once we get an answer, once we know more, we will definitely bring it to you so that way you guys know what is happening with that. So today I have with me Julie Eshelman, one of my good friends. I'm excited to have her here today and be able to talk with her about what her unique experience is like within the military. So Julie, welcome to the show. I'm glad you're here. Can you take a moment and introduce yourself to everybody?
Hi, everybody. I'm Julie Eshelman. I am a Army Reserve spouse, and my husband is part of the AGR program, which is basically active duty for the Army Reserve. And we have been together for, like 12 years. And so I've kind of experienced it all from girlfriend to spouse during his 12 plus year career so far. And we have been all across the country as a reserve family, which is a little bit different than the typical Army Reserve experience. But it's been a lot of fun. And so, Megan, if there's something else you want me to tell everybody, let me know.
Yeah, no, I think we're good with that. So as we dig into today, so today is about learning more about how our National Guard and Reserve families kind of differ from our active duty families, and to explore their unique circumstances and issues that they encounter being a part of the military, but sometimes kind of seen as like the stepchild of the military as well. So first, can you help explain what that difference is between National Guard and Reserve families? Because sometimes we often think they're the same thing, but they're not. And then just where does your family kind of fall on that line?
Yeah, certainly, Megan. So within the military community, you have the active component, which is typically what folks think of when they think of the military. They're thinking of the active duty, meaning the active component. And then there's the reserve component that is made up of the National Guard and the reserve forces. And so reserves are our federal military force. And then the National Guard is run by the states. And so, how that kind of differs is the National Guard has all of their resources through their individual states. There are some national resources for the National Guard, and they can be activated on federal orders and things by the president. But in general, when we're looking at the reserve component, the National Guard is state operated versus the reserves are federally operated. And so, how that differs is the National Guard, all of their resources, all of their units, all of their higher commands are all within their state. But when you're looking at the reserves, we're spread all across the country. And so, specifically within the Army Reserve, there are different regional commands. And so those regional commands oversee kind of your family programs and those resources. But then there's functional commands, and those are within, like, for the engineers, which is what my husband is. The 416th Tech is responsible for all of the engineer units for the western half of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 412th is responsible for all of the Army Reserve engineer units for the East Coast. And so there's a wide range from Chicago to Seattle for the 416th Tech. And they reach all the way down to California and Arizona. And then the 412th goes, all up and down the Eastern Seaboard, basically from Mississippi, Chicago, east. And then the 416th, a lot of fours, is everything west of Chicago. And so those functional commands are huge, and those are all the engineer units. And so we're spread across the country. And so when my husband was a company commander in Arizona, our higher headquarters, our battalion was in California, our brigade was in Washington, and our division was in Chicago. So that's where all of our, that's where the chaplains are. That's where a lot of the, FRISAs and family programs people are. They're not at that company level in Arizona. And so the National Guard, in Arizona or, whatever state you're in, has all their resources in one state. And so they don't have to go very far to have access to that chaplain. So hopefully that gives people a somewhat of a better understanding. I know it's still it's different from what the active component experiences and understands. And so I know that it can be a little confusing, and hopefully I did a good job explaining it.
I think you did, because I can definitely understand now more about, the Guard being state level, reserves being more federal, and how you can be spread out at multiple locations. So what are some of the unique challenges or obstacles that our National Guard and Reserve families face in life?
So I think one of the biggest things is that most of the time they're not at a military installation. In our experience, we've been at a reserve unit at an installation only once in my husband's career. The rest of the time we've been at standalone reserve centers. And so we may be several hours from the closest installation. And a lot of times, even when we are within an hour or two of an installation, it's not an Army installation. And so a lot of the programs that they offer aren't available to us. And that's been a challenge, specifically for my husband and I, not being able to access resources at a Navy installation or at an Air Force installation because we're Army. And that also leads to, some other differences. We don't have access to the commissary. We don't have access to clothing and sales is one of the big ones that, especially when the Air Force rolled out using the same uniforms as the Army, it was really hard for my husband to find new uniforms because we weren't at an installation. And when the closest installation didn't have any and they were sold out online, I mean, it was a little bit of a headache to try and find some new uniforms when his kind of wore out. But then even some of the things that I've learned the last several months while we've been at Fort Leavenworth are some of the resources available to families that have a spouse deployed. The installation takes care of their lawn care and their snow removal, whereas Reserve and National Guard folks don't always have that resource. We have to pay, like when my husband was deployed, I had to pay somebody to come mow our lawn because I had knee surgery and I couldn't do it myself. There was nobody else to come help and do that for us. Whereas on an installation, they have programs on the active component for that. So we're not near some of those resources that the active duty maybe takes for granted or doesn't even realize that maybe reserve folks might need something like that. Trying to think of another good example, but that's all I got for you at the moment.
We had talked previously about it. So moving, though, is also different with Guard Reserve families. Can you talk some about how that process also differs for you?
Yeah. So when my husband was a typical Army Reserve soldier, it's his choice to live for where he wants to live, whether he wants to live close to the unit that he drills at, or whether he wants to travel for drill weekends to a unit. And even though he was on active orders at that time for a set time period, I think he was on orders for like 9 months at a time. We made the choice at one point when he took a company command in Arizona, we made the choice to move down to Arizona. And it wasn't considered a PCS because of the way reserve assignments work. And so because he wasn't on full-time orders, even though he was working full-time, it's like a weird gray area that I can't really speak 100% on, but he wasn't, on orders that would qualify us for a PCS. And so we made the choice to move and buy a house down in Arizona and move from Washington. And so we did a ditty, to use the piece, an active duty PCS term, and do that all on our own. And it was overwhelming to do, to move and to make that decision. But, we were trying to build our family and we didn't want to be separated, and to do a geo batch, or anything like that. And so we made that choice. But if he was, not working full time in Arizona at that time and it was only drilling, he would commute from Washington down to Arizona. And there's programs for service members to be able to get reimbursed for some of that in the reserves for their commute and travel for drill weekends and whatnot. But we wanted to stay together, and so we moved. And then he got picked up for AGR orders following his deployment. And then we actually PCSed, on military orders. And that's a whole different ballgame because we're working with moving companies that aren't familiar with doing military moves because we're not stationed at installations and we get movers. And I understand that, active families don't necessarily always get movers that are familiar with the military process, but these movers have no idea. Our last move from the Chicago area here to Fort Leavenworth, I mean, the packing crew had no idea, and we kept telling them that they had to do the different things, that they're required to do for military moves, and they just couldn't comprehend it. They're like, but you're having things unpacked. Why do we have to label the things on the boxes? And we're like, because if the boxes get lost, we need to know what's in them. And so we're dealing with a lot of times people that don't know anything.
Yeah, no, we've been in some similar situations with that. We are at our second remote assignment. We spent a couple years up in Indiana, stationed at Camp Atterbury, which is a National Guard installation. And so why it was a little bit easier there because they have more active duty people that rotate in and out of that area. Where we're at now, there's very few active duty folks. And so when we come to move, I've already been looking and Googling the local agents, local moving companies, and it's been, I don't know, it'll be interesting. It'll be definitely an experience to see how all that goes. So doing a couple of the Diddy moves, moving yourself, what are some of the things that you learned through that process, maybe cost-saving tips that you could pass along?
I would say don't commit yourself to just one company. If you did a Diddy 5 years ago and the U-Pack was the cheapest option, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be your cheapest option this time around. And so doing the research to find out the rates in your area is a huge help. And really researching the area you're moving to will be really helpful. Because I know for us, I can't just go into a spouse group and be like, hey, tell me all the best places to live in Schuylkill Haven, Pennsylvania, because nobody's going to know where Schuylkill Haven, Pennsylvania is, unless you've been one of the handful of AGRs in the Army Reserve that have been stationed there. Or you're in the Pennsylvania National Guard and you're familiar with it because Fort Indian Gap is just down the road. But a lot of people there is nobody to get a recommendation for a lot of our remote locations. And so I have to go and do a lot of Google research. And don't be afraid to get onto Google and to look into those things. You can look at crime websites to see what crime is like in different cities, or towns where you might be moving to or where you might be interested in. Look at the school ratings if that's something that affects your family. I know when we were looking at moving down to the Scottsdale, Arizona area, I don't know if it was Forbes or what magazine or website had put it out, but Gilbert, Arizona at the time was the second safest city in America. And so we felt really comfortable looking for a home in Gilbert, which we ended up loving, and is someplace we may end up retiring because we loved Arizona so much, surprisingly. So those I think are some of I think my biggest tips is just don't be afraid of diving in and maybe getting a recommendation outside of the military community, because you can get a recommendation from a mom's group in whatever city you're going to on good neighborhoods. It's nice to rely on the military community, but if you're in that situation where you're going somewhere remote, whether you're active component or reserve component, there's ways to find. You might just need to, roll up your sleeves. But there's ways to be able to confidently find a good area to move to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the thing with the, the UPAC, the pods, all of that, we always say get a couple of estimates because it might
Yes.
vary. And then to also double check that they service both your losing location and your gaining location. Because I know pods, there's some areas that they don't service. And so I know some folks that have booked them and then come to find out they can't deliver and they have to go to like a warehouse 2 hours away with a rental truck to pick stuff up because they want it delivered to the area. So always double check that. And the local groups, not just spouses groups that you talked about, but like local community groups are a great resource, even for active duty families too, to find information on the area. Because I'll tell you, when we were moving to our current location, again, only a handful of active duty people here. There is no spouses group to join. So it's all local community groups. And so like joining them and asking about school districts, asking about different sports things, I will tell you, local folks are not afraid to like lay out like the truth of how things are. Because when I asked about schools, we got some interesting comments of avoid this one because it's filled with drugs, avoid this one because of this issue, and just all sorts of things. And it's just like, oh, but like this is enlightening to see and to know, and information we probably wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So those local groups are definitely a good resource for everybody. So just checking in the comments, we got a couple here. So John's watching. Good to see you again, John. If you guys missed it, we had John on a couple months ago talking about trunk moves. If you don't know what they are, go back and double check. There are these really cool trunks that get shipped to you and you pack it, and then like UPS, I think it's UPS, I could be wrong, don't quote me, but then like the shipping company comes and picks it up and like will take it and deliver it to your area. Really great concept, really neat and cool to see. And then we've got Tracy here that they will have their first non-Diddy move coming up as an AGR family. And that's interesting to know that movers may not be familiar with what a military move is. And I just want to say that kind of goes like across the board. And it kind of depends on that local agent and who's working that day, because the rotation of employees, sometimes they may not understand what a military move is versus a regular move. They may just be told, go pack this house, and think, they just know to pack a house. They don't know all of the stuff that needs to go on, all the requirements of it, depending on where they're at on the totem pole. So even active duty families, we get some of those issues too, Tracy. And John's backing me up here. It is UPS that takes those trunks and then delivers them. Really cool concept. We'll get the link for that dropped here into the comments, especially with PCS season coming up. It's definitely a great thing to look at and to check out. And so you talked a little bit previously about some of the services and support aspects and how they differ with National Guard, Reserve versus active duty. But can you go into a little more detail on so some of the services we see as active duty only. So if you're National Guard and Reserve, you don't get them. And then with TRICARE, that's a whole nother ball game type of thing, because TRICARE is only active for you during, I'm going to mess it. Is it Title 10 orders or 30?
There's different types of orders for the National Guard and for the reserves. I'm pretty sure reserves is Title 10 and National Guard's Title 12, but I don't really know. I just know that when my husband is activated, I think it's for at least 30 days, we're eligible for TRICARE. And so when he's activated for those periods of time where it's long enough for us, Um, there are sometimes hiccups where especially with some of the newer insurance laws, where
Mhm.
we might not have coverage for a certain number of days. And so our reserve and guard folks have to be mindful of those changes within the last several years, and try not to have a lapse in their coverage if they're going back and forth between TRICARE and another form of insurance. Um,
So is it almost like as a National Guard or Reserve family, you have to carry your own type of private insurance, and then when TRICARE kicks in because you meet that requirement, then you can just utilize that then?
and then honestly, that is going to be a very personal decision
Mhm.
for each family. For us, and my husband's just experience, I mean, he has spent very little time not on active duty orders, even though he's a reservist,
Mhm.
which is not typical for the reserve component. And so we've never really had to juggle with some of those choices. I know a lot of reserve and guard families only choose to make the switch for deployment or for long active duty orders because there is so much of a hassle to switch back and forth. And it depends on whether your primary health insurance, whether it's this through the service member's civilian job, or whether it's through the spouse's job. Sometimes those insurance plans are better than TRICARE, but sometimes TRICARE is better. So it's a very personal choice. But those are some of the things to kind of be mindful of is if you're making those switches to make sure that you don't have those gaps so that you don't get those penalties when it comes to filing your taxes. But I know a lot of families, and specifically when we were in Arizona and the unit deployed, a lot of families switched to TRICARE. And there was a little bit of a learning curve in knowing some of the rules for TRICARE in seeking referrals first. And, some of the things that those of us that are regularly on TRICARE Prime kind of know,
Mhm.
um, which served as for me was a good thing because I was able to help some of those families learn that learning curve with TRICARE, because we had been on TRICARE for so long. But typically, and I could be wrong. So if I'm wrong, somebody just call me out on it. But it's typically TRICARE kicks in when you're at least TRICARE Prime kicks in when you're on duty on orders for 30 days at least.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and so, but you don't have to choose to enroll in TRICARE. And so it's
Mhm.
looking at what the coverage is between your civilian insurance and the TRICARE and whether that's a choice for your family to make. Um,
Yeah.
Most active duty folks, I think, are almost all on TRICARE, unless the spouse has really good insurance.
Yeah. So I want to dive back into a little bit more of your story some. So there was a time where I think you were stationed in New York. I could be
Arizona.
completely Arizona. Were you ever stationed in New York, or am I
No.
making that up? No. So I'm totally making this up. So there was a time where you were stationed somewhere and you had the people assigned to all the different states, and there wasn't an FRG program that was stood up available at the time. And so you worked to create an FRG program to be able to support these families that fell under your unit. So can you tell us some about how you created this program and the challenges you face, and why a program like the FRG is needed for our National Guard and Reserve families too?
Definitely. So in my husband's 12 plus year career, in the Army Reserves, we have only had an FRG once.
Mhm.
And it wasn't for lack of family interest. Um, it was more lack of time, because it's a commander's program. And a lot of times in the reserves and National Guards, um, FRGs are only necessary during deployments. And so when my husband took the company command in Arizona, we had been at a unit for 7 years without an FRG, and so I never really had that connection to any of the spouses or girlfriends or fiancés, or husbands, or boyfriends of anybody in the unit. So I didn't really have that connection, even though, um, even though I wanted it, and there wasn't a good way to meet any of those people and to get that connection, which would have been nice during long annual trainings, to have other spouses to kind of connect with. And so when my husband took that company command in Arizona, and I knew that the unit was deploying, I was like, we need to have an FRG because these families are going to need that support system. And so, um, I went about building it from the ground up. It was a lot of work, but it was worth it. And I found, the second we started building it and I reached out to the families in the unit at a family day event, we went from just me to 13 volunteers in a matter of 2 or 3 months. And so we had a flourishing FRG, that, families were, we had families that would drive 4 hours to attend our monthly events. They drove from California to Arizona because they needed that connection and that family, camaraderie. But what is different, with a National Guard unit building something like that is, you may only have you have families spread out, generally just within your state. And so that might be 4 or 5 hours. If you're Texas, it might be a little bit longer of a drive because Texas, or California, or some of those bigger states are, it's going to be a lot longer of a drive. But generally in most of the states, it's just a couple of hours. But with the reserves, when we were in Arizona, and I think this is where you get the New York from, we had families from New York all the way to Hawaii.
I knew New York was in there somewhere of your story.
And so to have our families that spread out is challenging. And so to reach out, and reach all those families, we have to get creative, in how we reach those families. And so making sure that we had a really good newsletter, that had educational information in it, had updates from the unit while they were deployed or updates for events, was really crucial. And even partway through that, because we were in Arizona, we had a large Spanish speaking, population among our families. And we realized that we needed to translate our newsletter, so that we could reach and support those families as well. And so we have to get creative. And I see Tracy's comment. It is very true that they're not in the same area, because you're spread out, because those soldiers, or service members have the option to travel to where they drill. They don't have to live in that area. And some of the other challenges that I kind of alluded to before, chaplains aren't at the company level. And so when our unit was deployed from Arizona, we didn't have a chaplain there in Arizona for our families to reach out to. Our chaplain was in California. And the chaplain is a typical reservist only working one weekend a month. So to be able to reach out and get, support from them was really challenging. And so at times, our reserve, and I think this is true even on the Guard side, we have to reach into our local communities for some of those resources. But, even if you're going to, a pastor or a chaplain in your local community, they might not necessarily know how to support, a military family. And so sometimes finding that support is hard. And so finding a way to support through the FRG, can sometimes be challenging and finding those resources. But we make it work. And one of the ways that, I probably went a little bit against what, the regulations and whatnot, but we had our SFRG open to anybody that was in the area. So they didn't have to necessarily be Army, and they didn't have to necessarily be a part of our unit, because, recognizing that we had families in Hawaii and New York that I couldn't support locally with resources. I mean, I did my best to find them local resources when they needed it. But, my hope was that, a unit or a military organization or somebody in their area would kind of take them in and help them if I took in people that were in the Scottsdale area and gave them that support system, because it's hard to support people outside your local area. And so that's an area that I think, and I hope that someday the military community changes that and just becomes a support system in that local area versus by unit, because our reserves are so different than the active component. Because a lot of installations have installation resources that are open to all the units and all the military families in that area. So why aren't we that way on the reserve side?
Yeah.
That's probably like way outside of where you wanted this conversation to go. But that's
no, it's all good. It's all good, because our community, like they need to be able to hear this and be able to understand it a little bit more, because it's often a side of things that we don't hear frequently. And that, for me, it's definitely a side that we don't know about. Even after being stationed at an area with the National Guard installation, it's still a big piece that I don't understand. And I know a lot of people in our community don't really understand or know the differences between them. And so I think it's good to be able to hear these, these issues and what y'all go through, to be able to understand it a little more. So is there anything else about National Guard, Reserve families that we haven't already discussed that you want other folks to know about?
And I think the biggest piece, and this may be a good thing to end on, is just thinking about being more inclusive for Reserve and National Guard. Terms like, if you're a military organization that's listening and watching, I would ask you to really consider how you're phrasing your marketing. If you're saying for active duty and their families, that's not very inclusive for our reserve component. And so using terminology like currently serving, or just military families or service members and their families, is more inclusive, because when you say active duty, we assume it's something that's only eligible for the active component, because the active component and active duty are kind of one and the same in our minds. And so making, I understand, we get it as when we're not on active duty, that there are some resources or benefits that might not be available to us because it's exclusively for active duty, like TRICARE Prime is an active duty status, benefit. And so just being mindful of that to be more inclusive and welcoming of Reserve and Guard families, because we struggle too with a lot of the same things that the active duty components struggle with, underemployment and unemployment. Food insecurity is a thing for Reserve and National Guard families too. We need those mental health resources, all of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I have seen that, because I have some friends that are National Guard, and seeing that difference in the language that's used between, this is for active duty military or this is for currently serving, and just how that can be interpreted and differentiated between, and how that impacts, families on both sides of it. So to end our last question, the one thing I love asking all of the military spouses that I have on the show is, what is one piece of advice that you want to pass on to other spouses?
Oh, just one?
I mean, if you've got several, we've got some time. Whatever it is that you want to share for other spouses to know.
I think the biggest thing, and I think it's one of the things that I've really come to embrace the last several years, is to don't be afraid to speak up. And so, what that translates, don't be afraid to get involved. Don't be afraid to educate somebody if they're not understanding. And don't be afraid to share your story. And so just don't be afraid to speak up. and however you interpret that.
No, that's definitely some good advice. I think sometimes we get stuck into our shell of where we fit in life, but realizing that it is okay to speak up for something, to step outside of that box and outside of the comfort zone can be a really good thing for everybody. So I just want to say thank you for joining us today. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to spend some time with us and to help educate us and to share your experiences with National Guard Reserve families, so all of us can understand a little bit better, can all help take care of each other a little bit more. I really appreciate you being here today, Julie.
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to share my story and, to help others understand those differences so we can work better together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So everybody else, we hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday, great rest of the week. Join us again next week right here for another PCS Like a Pro show. We're going to be talking about something really fun next week that I'm looking forward to help us get ready for our PCS moves. So you don't want to miss it. Be back here, join us, and we will see you then. Bye, everybody.